Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Ron. Thank you all for being here. I was telling some folk coming in today that I feel about as inadequate about this particular talk as any talk, given the fact that I wrote it about 2 weeks ago and then I revised it, and things are moving so quickly right now, it's hard to keep track. Do we still trust democracy? Raise your hand if you still trust democracy.
I never did.
Okay, all right. Maybe a 60, 70%, but a little tentativeness on that. When I graduated from college, that question would have seemed unimaginable. But today I'm not sure whether this experiment in majority rule is going to survive, let alone flourish. In the 20th century, people thought that militarized and autocratic enemies of our country was the biggest danger. But now it's pretty clear that the danger is us. For decades, there have been warnings about this from both the left and the right. From the right, the Republican Senator Robert A. Taft worried most about a swollen bureaucracy that would choke off freedom and prosperity. On Capitol Hill, there's a bell tower memorial to him, and on it are his words that read, "If we wish to make democracy permanent in this country, let us abide by the fundamental principle laid down in the Constitution. Let us see that the state is the servant of the people, and that the people are not the servants of the state." Now, around the same time, the progressive ethical culture leader, Algernon Black, was expressing fears about excessive capitalism and social divisions. He wrote, "The crucial question is whether the democratic society can rid itself of its major defects: excessive inequalities, callous impersonality of relations, the ethics of the marketplace, the abuses of commercialization, racial and religious class divisions, and false values of lush materialism. Although democratic society must deal realistically with the threat of military conflict, it is endangered not so much by external forces as by inner weakness." End quote. So both the left and the right have been worried for different reasons about democracy, but today it seems that excessive radical extremism is our biggest danger. There's a very good little book I read about maybe 6 years ago. I think we even had a discussion here about it, called How Democracies Die, written by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Zidlatt. It explains how previously democratic states quite often elect despots, like Hitler, or in Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, or Obama. You can pick your choice. Voters use democracy to kill democracy. So is that where we are today, here? Have we drowned out Abraham Lincoln's call to defend government of the people and by the people and for the people? Have we allowed a small group of oligarchs to steal the country away from us because of their egos and power and wealth? So today I'm going to explore the nature of democracy a little bit, including our history of surviving anti-democratic fevers that come from the left or the right, and from both radical populism and from robber barons and the very, very wealthy. I'm going to conclude with 4 areas of work that I think is necessary to rebuild trust in democracy. So let me start by exploring what is democracy. Many of you, I bet, like me, grew up learning a little bit about democracy in school, and it was basically told to me that it was majority rule by an ever more inclusive community of informed and responsible citizens. That was the theory. I was taught about the Athenian democracy, where debates bubbled up in the public square, and I was told about town meetings in colonial New England. And I imagined that respectful interpersonal public dialogue would develop democratic habits. The ethical culture leader John Lovejoy Elliott, however, warned about saying that we should trust democracy without defining it. He counseled, "Only those can be relied on to be democratic, who have had democracy bred into them by face-to-face association, through learning and practicing a democratic way of life in working along with the people they actually know. Now, those credited for adapting democracy to larger and larger groups of people were the famed framers of the Constitution, because it's easy to have a democracy in a small group, or it's easier. But as I studied in high school and college, the idea that the framers were some sort of magicians gave way to a more realistic understory. Because I learned how many people were denied the rights that democracy promised them. In particular, those excluded from the Democratic Club were enslaved people and women. Representatives of those groups fought for political and economic rights to improve the democracy, and it became my heroes. People like Sojourner Truth or Frederick Douglass or Mary McLeod Bethune, who I'll quote later, or Eleanor Roosevelt or Dolores Huerta. And despite that racism and sexism, they believed in democracy, something I want to return to has a slightly more optimistic ending today. But political power did spread in the United States. After the Civil War, most men were given the vote, at least on paper. Women won the vote in 1920. The Civil Rights Movement led to more effective enforcement of voting rights. 18 to 20-year-olds who were dying in Vietnam won the vote in 1971. So there was a growing access to the vote. But despite the genius of the framers and the sweat and blood of the activists, distrust of democracy today is as high as it's ever been. According to the Pew Research Center, the year after I was born, 1958, 3/4 of Americans, quote, trusted the federal government to do the right thing almost always or most of the time. But then I believe lies about Vietnam, the criminality of Watergate, and economic struggles throughout the country began to affect public trust. There were surges of confidence around the 1980s and right after 9/11 actually, but they were not sustained. And since 2007, the percentage of those saying that they trust the government always or most of the time has not been higher than 30%. In 2022, an NPR survey found that 64% of Americans believe that the U.S. democracy is in crisis and at risk of failing. A Quinnipiac survey indicated that over 3/4 of respondents think that domestic political instability is more dangerous than external adversaries. Now, distrust of government correlates to a degree with the rise of money in politics. That's pretty well tracked. In 1976, in the ruling of Buckley versus Vallejo, the Supreme Court struck down regulations limiting campaign contributions, saying that they restricted free speech. In 2002, the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act struck back, and they prohibited soft money campaign contributions that weren't transparent. But then Citizens United in 2010 reversed that progress, and money flooded back into politics. Fred Wertheimer, who campaigned against corruption in government for his entire life, called the decision of Citizens United a disaster for the American people and the most radical and destructive campaign finance decision in Supreme Court history. Now, that case brought this ironic result of an economically struggling middle class, resentful of elites, handing the White House to elites, to a cabal of kleptocrats using government to enhance their power and wealth. So I want to go back into the history to try to figure out more how we got there. Now, historically, distrust of government has two main sources. Fear that the wealthy elites are going to use it for their own advantage, and fear that it'll be misused by irrational masses. Sort of feels like both have come up today. But let's look more into the fear of masses to begin with, which was something very much in the psyches of those who wrote the Constitution. In The Atlantic, Jeffrey Rosen, who's the head of the Constitution Center, wrote an interesting article about how James Madison really feared the masses. He called them the mob. And he got that fear from studying history about how direct democracies are inherently unstable. Along with Hamilton, Madison knew that Greek's democracy, for example, succumbed to public passions that were manipulated by demagogues. This would eclipse the disinterested and rational leaders that were so heralded by the Enlightenment thinkers. Madison didn't have to look far to have that fear confirmed, because in the United States of his time, there were disturbances all over the country that were basically at the root due to economic hardships right after the Revolution. Daniel Shea, for example, and a small army of debtors attacked creditors, the Massachusetts governor, and the state assembly. Now, Madison referred to these grassroots groups as factions. That's what you read in his writing, which were, quote, united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. So he feared that destruction. Now, not long after Shays' Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion flared in western Pennsylvania in 1791. The farmers resented taxes that were placed on grain that was used to distill liquor. For a couple of years, government officials were threatened, particularly tax collectors, tarred and feathers quite often. President Washington himself, as president, led an army of 13,000 troops to put down the rebellion. So that fear was real. And just across the Atlantic, the French Revolution was demonstrating the danger of mob violence. American leaders read in horror about this radical violence that was committed by the common people and their representatives, the demagogues that were involved there. In 1793, France's Committee of Public Safety, which was really a de facto wartime government, arrested 300,000 citizens, executed 17,000, and let 10,000 more die in jail. So there was no wonder that the framers had multiple safeguards to try to keep the masses at bay. They reinforced that this was a representative democracy, not a direct democracy. They separated the federal power into three branches. They separated power between the federal government and the state government. Senators were elected by the state legislatures, not by the people, all to try to keep the masses at bay. As the U.S. gained its balance, average citizens became more concerned about the wealthy who were taking over the government and seeming to act like kings. Federalists created a national infrastructure that helped everybody, but in particular helped the wealthy. After the Civil War, the Gilded Age saw the robber barons controlling lawmakers that gave them land grants and tax breaks and favorable trade policy. And though President Grant was personally quite honest, he was surrounded by wealthy patrons who received government contracts and special favors. So rich families like the Vanderbilts and the Astors were joined by the new industrialists like Carnegie, Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, and Morgan. And they created a powerful upper class. And there was corruption at every level of government, all the way down, particularly cities. Many of you have read about Boss Tweed in New York, who rewarded his voters with inflated government contracts and gifts. There was a political kingmaker named Mark Hanna who quipped, quote, "There are two things that are important in politics. The first is money, and I can't remember what the second one is," end quote. As chair of the Republican National Committee, he channeled $100,000 of his own money to get William McKinley elected. He became an expert in political contribution. He assessed banks and businesses' money and directly funneled it to the Republican Party. Now, there was pushback by progressives, which began to restrain moneyed interests. People like Senator Bob La Follette of Wisconsin or President Teddy Roosevelt curbed corporate excesses and protected workers and consumers. And FDR did even more when the country was racked by the Depression. And public trust in democracy was growing and grew even more after the Allied victory, when it seemed like democracy was here to stay all around the world. But by 1980, moneyed interests were back in control. That's the danger of money. It keeps seeping in. Bolstered by the Buckley ruling, the National Conservative Political Action Committee spent $2 million to get Reagan elected, and soon Democrats were following suit. In the 10 months before the 1996 election, Bill Clinton spoke at over 230 fundraising events. The DNC channeled $122 million in soft money into their candidates. And campaign finance reform activist Wertheimer, that I mentioned before, complained that campaign finance laws have been replaced by the law of the jungle. Though common folks on both the left and the right complained, money ruled. Well, contemporary discontent for democracy and the government soared when the Republican Party mastered using distrust to gain power. This has been a topic I've talked about many times. Ronald Reagan wrote into the White House on the phrase, "The government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem." That became a theme a generation later with the rise of the Tea Party, one of the most anti-government, regressive movements in history. It declared that government was the root of all evil and that taxes were legalized theft. Support for an outsider culminated in the 2016 election of Donald Trump. And Trump used public mistrust and anger to attack democracy. Even in his first term, Trump broke most of his basic our democratic norms. He attacked the media, he praised tyrants, he demanded personal loyalty from government officials, he turned the Justice Department into a personal political tool, he pressured public health agencies to downplay the pandemic, and he stoked internal divisions instead of trying to unite the country. And things have only gotten worse as the Republican Party has failed to rein him in. They've abdicated their responsibilities to defend our electoral system and our Constitution. Trump has engaged in patronage in unprecedented fashion, filling agencies with his loyalists, using presidential executive actions to violate the separation of powers. And since the administration has thrown away our global obligations and our bilateral responsibilities, the rest of the world no longer trusts American democracy. And it may be decades, if ever, that we rebuild that trust. This is depressing enough. What I find more depressing is that my own faith in democracy is being tested. Many progressives and liberals around the country also feel this. I'm sure some of you do too. While there are protests against the administration, I was at one in Baltimore yesterday against ICE, and that's a good thing that they're happening. I need more. So for the rest of my time, I'm going to lay out 4 overlapping strategies gathered from people smarter than me about this to help us rebuild the trust in democracy. And I'll admit, these are not all immediate, some are long-term, and given what's going on now, they're tall orders. So let me start with these 4. These are the 4 I'll end with. Healing personally and interpersonally. We need to heal. Defend our civic institutions. We need to reform our electoral system. And we need to treat democracy as sacred. Now, there are many, many other things we can do, but I'm going to focus on those 4. Let me start with healing, personally and interpersonally. After the election, a lot of folks on the left declared that they were taking a break from activism. Some weren't reading the paper or watching the news. Many of you perhaps are not even now, because they needed to heal. Now, this may seem a bit self-indulgent, especially for somebody like me who lives a pretty comfortable life, but I think we do need to promote self-care. Now, self-care is an overused term, but we need to do that if we are going to heal and be in this for the long haul, and it is going to be a long haul. Now, taking time to heal does not mean accepting unconstitutional, illegal, and harmful policies and practices. It's not advocating that. So let's not slide from momentary healing into the acceptance of the unacceptable. The dangers for democracy, according to Levitsky and Ziblatt, is the tendency to, quote, define deviancy down. And we have done that and are doing that. We can't allow the feeling overwhelmed to desensitize us. So we have to heal in order to re-engage. It's interesting, in a lot of the reading, I'm hearing a lot of advice coming from Eastern Europe. For a generation or two, the United States gave advice to Eastern Europe on how to build democracy, and it's come the other way now. Pavel Slotkin, who's a former diplomat from Belarus, said, "The worst thing that Americans could do now is to stay out of politics. We must re-engage." At the same time, we need to heal interpersonally. Talked to Sylvia about this when she came in today. Relationships with those who oppose us politically need to be rewoven. I have given advice that sometimes you gotta let go of some relationships, that's true. But ones that have any potential to be saved, maybe stay away from politics, but reweave those relationships. Connect where you agree. Connect with interests you like. We have to reactivate the democratic norms of toleration and forbearance. These have helped those on opposite sides of the aisle work together. I mean, it used to be that Republicans and Democrats had weekend cookouts together. Their children played together. They knew each other personally. But today, it seems that we only speak in silos. Political disagreements that used to be discussed over coffee are now instantly weaponized on social media. Disagreements that were once mundane have now become toxic. Political tactics have been radicalized over the past half century. I remember when Nixon told his chief of staff, Haldeman, "We're up against an enemy, a conspiracy. We're using any means." Is that clear? Political parties went from minimizing extremism to creating extremism. Political parties used to be what kept the extremes away. Things got uglier as the congressional and executive branches fought for supremacy. Congress began to use their advice and consent powers more aggressively. They increased the use of the filibuster and the threat of impeachment. And meanwhile, presidents gave more and more executive orders and patronage pardons. And the executive branch has been winning. The imperial presidency, as the historian Arthur Schlesinger called it, has increased extremism. Demagoguery, lying, manipulation, constitutional hardball are now the norm. And this is made worse when we fight fire with fire, which is tempting to me. That's tempting to all of us right now. But Levitsky and Ziblatt argue that we should not veer into extremism because they say that that only plays into the hand of authoritarians who use it to justify cracking down. Sir John Savicic at the Belgrade Center for Security and Policy, who's an expert on dictators, said, "My advice to Americans is never relax, always be on guard. Democracy is not given. The most important thing is to defend solidarity and human decency. Do not allow the enemies of democracy to lower your own standards of political behavior." I'm trying. Maintaining standards of political behavior was emphasized by George Odell, who a century ago was very involved in the American Ethical Union. He wrote, "Democracy is something more than the pulling of a lever in a polling booth. It means the appeal to think in social terms, to belong consciously in a community, to share intelligence with others, to do one's work in the world so as to enhance the working power of an achievement of others, to recognize that class barriers and economic distinctions are an insult to the human soul, that in all persons there is the possibility of decency in all persons. Heal inside and heal with each other. Second piece of advice, perhaps the most important, is to defend our civic institutions. We have seen how easy it is for the administration to destroy government groups like the Agency for International Development. We have a very close friend living in our house now who is a senior administrative person for AID, who is now on administrative leave and is anticipating never returning. The president has been attacking civic NGOs, the press, universities. All of those institutions may have problems, but we need to fix those problems and defend those institutions, not throw them away. Natalie Tocci, who is the director of Italy's Institute of International Affairs, offered this advice to Americans about defending democracy. She said, the short answer is institutions, institutions, institutions. We even have to defend institutions that are part of our separation of powers. We have to defend the courts and Congress and tell them to do their jobs. They have to defend the rights of citizens, the rights of non-citizens, defend the laws, defend the Constitution. We also have to defend the press while demanding they do their job. In the last administration, Trump had threatened to challenge the licenses of news outlets that were critical of him, like NBC. And then, 10 days ago, he barred the AP from being in the Oval Office because they kept calling the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of Mexico. We have to protect the press and demand they do their job. The media also has to filter out fake news that's been rampant since it defeated Hillary Clinton. So let's fund media literacy training. That is a longer-term project, but we need to do that to stop the spread of false information. We have to take away the power of the big lie. Some state boards of elections, like in New Mexico and North Carolina, have started public education and election fact-checking groups called Mythbusters in order to bolster protection of our trust in democracy. Connecticut just invested $2 million to combat misinformation about elections before it gets viral. Schools and universities have to teach news literacy. In 2021, Illinois became the first state to require media literacy courses in high school. Let's get that in Pennsylvania. Digital informers at Howard University are doing similar work, working with churches and civic institutions and nonprofits. Through established and trusted relationships, they're trying to combat misinformation. Again, face-to-face associations are involved. 3, we have to reform our electoral system. It's going to be tough right now, I know that, but this is a long-term project. Most obviously, we have to help people be able to vote. Those who want minority rule are going to resist that and have, but Glenn Smith, who wrote an article called Voting Rights, Democracy, and the Dignity of Man, said we should expand early voting. Election day itself should be made a holiday. We should streamline registration efforts that allow for same-day registration. We should have real universal voting standards that apply to all citizens no matter where they live. And we have to get money out of politics. From 1974 to 2008, the average cost of a congressional campaign went from $56,000 to $1.3 million. The 2010 Citizens United really did damage there. It's one reason why I got involved in Democracy Spring in 2016. You may remember this was a march from the Liberty Bell down to Washington, D.C. I didn't do the whole march, but I met them along the way. It demanded that Congress take immediate action to end corruption of big money in politics. 400 people were arrested, one of the biggest arrests on Capitol Hill ever. It demanded that the Congress of Conscience pass laws to increase grassroots voting participation. and we have to continue to demand this reform. The Voting Rights Act has been stripped of almost all of its power. We have to reinstitute those elements. We should end gerrymandering, and a lot of these are problems of both parties. Let's have more open primaries. Let's do more experiments with ranked choice voting. And given the fact that the 2016 presidential election winner lost the popular vote by 3 million, it really is time to end the Electoral College. We have to incentivize voting. The activist Susan Jacoby wrote that voting is a civic obligation. She said that's the case in good economic times or in bad, whether you like the candidates or not, whether you have some disagreements with the candidates or not, whether you're feeling optimistic about the future or not, whether you have a bad cold when you get up on election day or not. Apathy and a lack of enthusiasm is no excuse. FDR put it this way, I love this. He said, "Nobody will ever deprive the American people of the right to vote except the American people themselves, and the only way they could do this is by not voting." Finally, and relatedly, to build faith in democracy, I think we need to treat it as sacred. That word may not fit for you, it works for me. And I don't mean going back to the mythic idealization of the founders and the framers and the city on the hill, because I've learned most about the sacredness of democracy from those groups most denied it. From women and from Black Americans. I mean, I just recently reread the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, penned in Seneca Falls Convention. It reads, "In view of this entire disenfranchisement of 1/2 of the people of this country, their social and religious degradation, in view of the unjust laws above mentioned, and because women do themselves feel aggrieved, oppressed, and fraudulently deprived of the most sacred rights, we insist that they have immediate admissions to all the rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of the United States." It's amazing a document that old needs to be reread. I'm inspired by Mary McLeod Bethune, who in 1939 offered this framing: "Democracy is for me and for the 12 million Black Americans a goal towards which our nation is marching. It is a dream and an ideal in whose ultimate realization we have a deep and abiding faith. We have always been loyal when the ideals of democracy have been attacked. We have given our blood in defense, from Crispus Attucks on Boston Commons to the battlefields of France. We have fought for the democratic principles of equality under the law, equality of opportunity, equality at the ballot box, and for the guarantees of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Yes, we have fought for America with all her imperfections. We have fought for all of America, not for what she is, but what we know she can be." I'm so inspired by those who are so mistreated by democracy, but continue to defend it. And it tells me I better do better myself. Faith in the potential of democracy is very humbling. It's echoed in the contemporary advocates for rebuilding democracy. Scholar Ben Barber writes, "What is required is nothing more than a faith in the democratizing effects that political participation has on people. A faith not in what men and women are, but what in democracy makes them." Even before our national government, the philosopher Edmund Burke appreciated that potential of democracy requires a deep commitment. He wrote that democracy is to be looked on with reverence. It is a participation in all science, a participation in all art, a participation in every virtue, and in all perfection. The Reverend William Barber, who this coming Wednesday is marching from the Supreme Court to the Capitol to demand true democracy, advocates for this reverential partnership. He said, "The ballot box should be regarded as a sacred place. And it's the sweat and the sacrifice of the activists that really make it sacred. They have sanctified the ballot. Now, ultimately, democracy needs to be defended by average citizens like you and me. In 1937, Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis contrasted America with Nazi Germany. He said, "The only title in our democracy superior to that of president is the title of citizen." That's something that Brandeis's brother, our own Felix Adler, took to heart. Adler, in founding Ethical Culture, appreciated the role of the citizen and the sacredness of democracy, especially when comparing the U.S. to the Europe that he fled as a young boy. In the middle of the 19th century, there were flickers of democracy and human rights in Europe, but they were stomped out by authoritarians. They threatened many liberals, including Adler's uncle, who was jailed for his labor activities. Adler found the democracy of America inspiring, particularly how it defended both the individual and the collective. You don't have to sacrifice one for the other. And this fulfilled what he called the spiritual end of democracy. The spiritual end of citizenship. Adler issued a similar warning to the warning given in How Democracies Fail. A century before that book was published, Adler wrote, "When I speak of anti-democratic tendencies in American life, I mean aristocratic or oligarchical. Oligarchical tendencies already exist in our midst and are getting stronger and stronger. Things have not yet come to such a pass in America, but the time has come when it behooves us to reflect on the actual drift of things." And today it's clear that the drift of things is to protect moneyed interests over the project of democracy. And that's terrifying. But in terrifying times, it's especially important to remain calm and focused and inspired by the potential democracy offers. I hope that the inspiration that sprinkled through today, and I hope that the history I've shared, helps us realize that we've been through tough times before. Yes, this may seem darker, but we need to stay calm. Ethical Culture, Howard Radist, who I met about 15 years ago before he died, wrote an article called "Democracy in a Time of Terror." He urged us not to retreat, but to expand the democratic spirit. He said democratic values, integrity of persons, trustfulness between persons, hopefulness from persons, endure beyond wealth and strength. It is these values that together make democracy not merely a political arrangement, but a mode of living. Let's make it our mode of living in ethical culture and in the world. Thank you very much.